All right, guys, welcome back to our study in the book of Daniel. Now, the last time we were here, we completed chapter 5 in looking at the fall of Babylon under Belshazzar, the great grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And basically, what we had was, it was during the time when the Persian armies were surrounding Babylon, and Belshazzar, in arrogance and overconfidence, believing that the walls of Babylon were impenetrable and that they had food supply and water supply to last for 20 years or even more, he threw a banquet for his noblemen and for his number of wives and concubines. The problem came when he brought in from the house of God that Nebuchadnezzar had taken when he had came into Jerusalem some of the vessels, and he used that for drinking. It's almost like a not so much as an orgy, but the whole sense of its drunkenness and revelry as he celebrated the gods, or the idol gods, of Babylon. In judgment, a hand appeared on the wall writing the words Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin. He was afraid. Matter of fact, he was so afraid that his knees began to knock together. And so he did what kings would normally do. He called in his counselors to interpret the handwriting on the wall and promised to give them great gifts and promote them to third ruler in Babylon. We talked about how that was the case itself, but check out the video if you haven't. So they were unable to do so. So all of a sudden the queen came and made the king aware of Daniel and that he had the gift to interpret dreams and give interpretations to difficult things. And she told him, call in Daniel. So the king called in Daniel, and when he did so, he promised Daniel the same thing. He would make him great third ruler in the kingdom, give him wealth if he was able to interpret the handwriting on the wall. Daniel interpreted the handwriting on the wall, Mene, Mene, meaning numbered, that God had numbered the days of Belshazzar's reign. And then also Tekel, he was found wanting. His moral and spiritual character did not add up. And the reason why is because Daniel gave, even before this interpretation, he gave somewhat of a sermon to Belshazzar concerning his father, that is his great-grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, how that God had dealt with him after Nebuchadnezzar exalted and made himself arrogant against the God of heaven. And God put him through, remember this thing, zoanthropy is what we talked about it, how God gave him a psychotic episode that lasted for 7 years until Nebuchadnezzar would recognize that God was sovereign in the heavens and the earth, and he ruled over the affairs of men. But Belshazzar, and the key, knowing all of these things, did not learn the lesson of his grandfather, and thus he fell under judgment. And so, after giving that interpretation, Belshazzar was true to his word. He honored Daniel to be third ruler, which didn't last long, because that very night the Persians invaded the city and they killed Belshazzar. And that was the end of not so much as the end of Babylon totally, because Babylon was not destroyed. It was just simply conquered, and now it is the Medes and the Persians, according to the image that Daniel interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar. Remember the arms of silver. The Medes and Persians are now the new world empire. And remember the whole thing you have to keep in mind, the Gentile world empire. Okay. And so with that, he talks about what? Darius. Now we have Darius the Mede coming into power. All right. With all of that being said, now let's go to chapter 6, and it's one of the most famous stories that most people know, Daniel in the lion's den. And sad, let me say this too, guys. It is so sad. I have noticed that many children don't even know Bible stories, Daniel in the lion's den, Noah's Ark, and things of that nature. All of the great stories that we once knew and appreciated as children. It was just a common knowledge for us back in the day. It is so strange how children, see, that's because they're unchurched. Okay, I don't want to get into that. But there is a problem when you think about what I'm trying to say. The children don't even know the Bible stories that we grew up on. This is a generation, a prepared generation for idolatry, a prepared generation for the rise of the Antichrist. All right, I knew I should not have gone that direction, but okay, I'm sorry. Daniel chapter 6. Now, once again, this story concerning Daniel and the lion's den is set in a very prose literary type. It's as if it's trying to tell you a story, right? And so therefore we're going to do what we've been doing for the most part with Daniel. We're going to read through it and I'll comment along the way, because there's nothing so difficult that we may not be able to understand. Now, there may be a couple of points, no doubt it will be, that we'll stop to bring out certain emphasis and certain thematic points that God is trying to bring about. And okay, might as well. God is faithful. God is loyal to those who are faithful and loyal to God. This theme is being reiterated in chapter 6. It's the same theme that we had in Daniel chapter 2. Remember the 3 Hebrew boys who were put in the fiery furnace? What did they do? They remained faithful to God. They refused to bow to idols. They refused to serve any other god, and therefore they were punished. But God was faithful to those who were faithful to him, and he rescued them from this punishment, right? Punishment of serving any other god. And remember too, the idea serving any other god was not simply the gods of Babylon, but, now pay close attention to this one, it was a man who made himself to be God. Remember, that was the whole idea of this great statue of a man that Nebuchadnezzar saw, himself being the head of gold. And what did Nebuchadnezzar do? He made a figurine, no doubt, of a man overladen with gold, depicting himself with the command for people to bow. So the idea, not only just simply idol worship, but worshiping of a man who is trying to make himself to be God. And we're going to see a similar issue here. So again, the theme of Daniel chapter 6 is nothing more than a reiteration of Daniel chapter 2, that same theme, God's faithfulness to those who are loyal to him. All right. Now, with that being said, it's about 28 verses, but I think it'll go pretty rapidly because we're not going to comment a lot on it, because it basically speaks for itself. So let's begin. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Okay, so basically what we have is a change in the government. Why? Because the Medes and the Persians have now taken over Babylon, and so they need to prepare the kingdom for a proper administration. So Darius, and let me make a comment concerning him, Darius determined to set up 120 governing officials that are called satraps over the kingdom. Of these 120 satraps, there were also 3, it's called here, commissioners that he chose. And one of those 3 commissioners over the satraps was Daniel. So we had an organization of 120 satraps. With those 120 satraps, 3 commissioners were set above them. So probably you had 40 satraps responding to these other to the commissioners. They were under the authority of the commissioners. And because Daniel was one of them, this became problematic. And it's an issue of jealousy, similar to what we also saw in chapter 2, the issue of, no doubt, jealousy. But we'll talk about that as we move on. But before we do that, let me make a comment about Darius, because there is no or very little external historical evidence in records outside of the Bible about this Darius ruling over Babylon during this period. Some believe that this may have been made up, or there is difficulty in identifying who Darius is. There are certain possibilities. Remember Ugbaru that we talked about in the last video, the one who was responsible for the attack against Babylon at the time? It is possible that this is his name, because people often had a number of names, especially when they would be elevated to some type of a royal throne, a royal rule. So it is a possibility. Some believe that it might be Cyrus who sent in this Darius, who was once Ugbaru, right? That's one idea. Possibility, it may be Cambyses, who I believe was the son of Cyrus, This is something that it could be his name, Cambyses, right? Some even think it's possible that it might be a ruling name for Cyrus himself. However, I don't go with that last part, especially as we look at the final statement in this particular chapter. That is, so this Daniel, verse number 28, enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So it appears that these were 2 separate men. So Darius was not a name for Cyrus. So I honestly believe that it's possible maybe Ugbaru or someone appointed to rule the kingdom on behalf of Cyrus. All right. Now, with that said, we can get into the text. So Darius made this appointment so that he could rule effectually the empire of Babylon. The 3 commissioners, of which these were the highest offices in the land, those 3 commissioners outside of Darius, of course. And Daniel was one of them. And it was this appointment of this Jewish man Daniel that would provoke these other commissioners and satraps to jealousy and make them act against Daniel. But anyway, verse 3, then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And the king planned, now this is the problem. What? The king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. That's the problem. It comes out of jealousy. Once again, we're told about the extraordinary abilities of Daniel. And remember, Daniel was over the province of Babylon during for at least about 39 years of Nebuchadnezzar's rule. So Daniel had great experience, plus the undeniable fact he was blessed of God. That's one of the first things it said that God did. Remember in chapter 1, when these Hebrew boys, Daniel and his 3 friends, refused to pollute themselves with the king's food. They wanted to remain loyal to God, and God blessed them with extraordinary abilities, especially Daniel, as we've already come to know about. So this is now being seen by the king, by Darius. He now recognizes Daniel is really good at what he does, and he now thinks to himself, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to move him from being one of the 3 commissioners. Remember, that was the highest positions anyway, until being over the entire kingdom. And that was the problem. Then the commissioners, verse 4, and the satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could not find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. So quite simple. They look for Daniel to be, is he corrupt? Can there be in his affairs in running the government? Can we find some type of an accusation that can have Daniel removed or at least disfavored by the king? We don't want him to be put over all of us. That's the idea. But Daniel was faithful in his duties, and he was trustworthy in all the things that the king, whether Nebuchadnezzar or now Darius, had set in his hand. He was a faithful man. So they couldn't find accusation. So they had to find something else. 5. Then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. So they knew. Okay, here is the inference here. They had been watching Daniel to find out, is he faithful in governmental affairs? Answer, yes. So we can't do anything about that. However, we also know too, he has some sort of an Achilles heel. What is that? His faithfulness to his God. He had an unbreakable loyalty to God, and therefore they surmised within themselves, we will use his faithfulness to God in order to entrap him. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius live forever. All the commissioners, now that's a lie, because remember, Daniel was one of the 3 commissioners. So you only have 2 commissioners coming before him, but they act as if they speak for them all. Remember, they're trying to entrap Daniel. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, high officials, and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god, that's the key right there, any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. So they go and say they're trying to, it's always this thing about trying to make the king feel good and make the king feel, well, he's already the most important person as it is. So they really are assuaging his ego, so to speak, in trying to come to the king as God. Notice the whole point of it all. Make a petition. The idea is as if to pray. As if to pray. And so therefore, they're going to the king and saying, you are a God. And if anybody prays to any other God besides you, then throw that man into the lion's den. Please, king, make this a statute. And so they're kind of trying to deceive, and they are deceiving the king, and at the same time they're making him feel good, right? What happens? Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document. Make it a decree of law so that it may not be changed. Now, this is what is important. It cannot be changed. Once the Persian king signs something into law so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. That is, once the king signs something as law, even the king himself, as we're going to see later on, can't change the law. The king is subject even to the laws, even to his own law. Now, let me make an aside note here. This also was a distinction between, this is why you go from gold, remember the statue of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold, and then the silver. Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold, was not subject to any law. He could break whatever law he chose. He could make whatever law he wanted to. He could break whatever law he wanted to. Remember what the scripture says, whom he desired to kill, he killed. And if he wanted to save somebody alive or to exalt them, He did that. So this shows that the power of the Persian king is not as great as the power that Nebuchadnezzar once held. But anyway, so they said, do this according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. The king felt pretty good. Yeah, don't let nobody have to pray to anybody but me. I'm a god. So he felt good. But he was unaware that they were using him to come at Daniel. What happens? Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, you see that already we're getting into the theme of this particular chapter. Daniel was faithful and loyal to God. And now all of a sudden, he hears of an ordinance of the king that you're going to be thrown into the lion's den if you pray to anybody other than the king. Nevertheless, as we already know, Daniel will continue to pray to his God, continue to be loyal to his God, even under the threat of death. This is parallel with the Hebrew boys and the fiery furnace. What did the Hebrew boys say? We're not careful to answer you in this matter, O king. We will not serve your gods, knowing the outcome, knowing that they would be put to death. So we see the same thing with Daniel. What did he do? He entered his house. Now on his roof chamber, he had windows open towards Jerusalem. He would always, it was a common thing to pray on the roof. And since he was exiled into Babylon, he would pray towards Jerusalem. That is what once was the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, the temple is destroyed now. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day. Now we also see the extent of Daniel's loyalty. But at the same time, we got to remember, Daniel is responsible so much for the kingdom. And so much has been placed in his hands with respect to authority and managing the great estate of Babylon. So he would pray 3 times a day. Notice what he did in the prayer. Praying and giving thanks before God. Do I even need to comment? Thanking God what he has done, where he has placed him, even the burden of management, but nevertheless, it was a privilege to be in that position. Thanking God, no doubt, for the preservation of his own people. But I won't get into all of that. But he thanked God, right? He thanked God, and he did as he had been doing previously. In other words, knowing that the document was signed, pray to nobody but King Darius, Daniel continued to pray. Who knows how many days thereafter. But let's go. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before God. So what does that say before his God? What does it say? They had been watching Daniel. They knew how Daniel scheduled his time of prayer. They didn't just perhaps upon Daniel. They knew he prayed 3 times a day, and he prayed during these times. And so what did they do? They waited for one of those particular times and bombarded into the room in order to catch Daniel breaking the king's command in praying to Daniel's own God and not to the king. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Now they say, oh, we got him now. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you? See that? They're trying to equate the king as God. That's what made him feel good. O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den. So they reiterated, King, didn't you say that this was the new ordinance? Can't pray to anybody but you. The king replied, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Notice the emphasis, the reiteration. The law cannot be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah. Notice how they reference Daniel. Remember, Daniel was one of the commissioners. There were only 3 commissioners. They had the highest position in the land. But notice how they referred to Daniel. They didn't refer to him by giving him the respect that he should have been given, but calling him an exile from Judah. And also, too, can't you sense the anti-Semitism in the back of their throats? That Jewish hatred, no doubt, but specifically that jealousy and hatred for Daniel. But Daniel, notice how they put it, pays no attention to you. They're trying to enrage the king. It was the same wording, similar, that they said concerning the 3 Hebrew boys. They pay no attention to you. Here's the idea. You pay no attention to the king, the one who can execute you according to his word, but they pay no attention to you, and what else? Or to the injunction which you sign. They disregard you and the law, but keep making his petition even 3 times a day. He's not just praying, disregarding praying to you. He keeps praying to his God all through the day. Then, but notice, instead of them having this response from the king, remember, they're trying to make the king angry. But clearly, the king had developed some type of affection toward Daniel, a genuine concern for Daniel. Whether or not that concern was born out of Daniel's usefulness, remember it said earlier that Daniel showed extraordinary ability. So you don't want to lose a valuable service. But regardless to the point, they did not expect the king to respond. They wanted him to be angry and sentenced Daniel angrily to the lion's den. But they got the very opposite. As soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. So remember the whole point we kept saying. The laws of the Medes and Persian cannot be changed. Once the king makes the law, even the king cannot break the law. He is subject to the law. So the king, after he has found out the trickery of these men in trying to get Daniel delivered into the lion's den, he tried to deliver Daniel. He pulled every rabbit out of the hat that he thought he could. But the final analysis of it all was what? Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, listen, you can stop trying to get Daniel out. Recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persian that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. In other words, king, give it up. You cannot get Daniel out of this predicament. The law is even above you yourself. So resigned to that fact and to that truth, then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. So now the king, you can see the king in a saddened state as he has to release Daniel to be delivered into the lion's den, regrettably. But at the same time, notice, it seems that the king is aware of Daniel's God and somewhat aware, clearly, of Daniel's faith. And therefore, the king himself is starting to have faith in Daniel's God. What did he say? Your God, whom you serve constantly. Notice that whom you serve constantly. The point about what? Being faithful to God. Again, bringing in the theme of the chapter. Your God will deliver you. Parallel the same idea of Daniel chapter 2. But the point, even the king began to have some faith in God. But nevertheless, he is still extremely agitated and worried about Daniel's safety. What happened? 17, a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, so Daniel couldn't get out. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of his noble. Why the signet ring? What is the seal? The ring that placed in the clay. Why is this done? So that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. In other words, this is by a royal edict of the king as well as his official that Daniel being placed in the lion's den, he should not be released by virtue of a royal edict. Then the king went off to his palace. Remember that agitation. And spent the night fasting, unusual for a king. Why should the king care? He has millions of people, no doubt, that he could employ per se, but nevertheless, fasting and no entertainment was brought before him. Again, another unusual thing to depict what? The consternation of the king in his worry for Daniel, and his sleep fled from him. He was truly worried about Daniel, and he suffered in this agitated state all night long. What happened? Then the king rose at dawn. Notice, you can see the eagerness, the concern of the king for Daniel to arise at dawn, at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. Remember, kings don't run and all that kind of stuff like that. It was a certain dignified appearance that kings always wanted to have. But forget dignity. Forget what I look like. I want to know, says Darius, is Daniel okay? Was his God able to deliver him? What happened when he come near to the den to Daniel? He cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, and I like this part. Listen, servant of the living God. Now, that tells you he has a moniker of an idea of who Yahweh, the God of the Jews, he is the true God. He is the living God. Has your God, again, whom you constantly serve, faithfulness and loyalty to God. God does what? Results in God's faithfulness and loyalty to you. That's that thing. Again, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king without anger. He knew it wasn't the king's fault. He knew the king was tricked. He knew it was because of those two commissioners and other satraps who got together to come up with this so-called edict to have Daniel cast into the lion's den. He respectfully responded to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel." Again, notice the parallelism that we have with the three Hebrew boys. What did Nebuchadnezzar say? He said, listen, did we not put 3 into the furnace? There are 4, and one is like one of the sons of the gods, or an angel. And again, what do we see? The accompaniment of an angel to protect God's people, to protect those who are faithful to God. My God sent an angel, and you guys, I'm gonna just let you ponder this by yourself. The powers of angels. We know it's a limit to it. However, man, those guys are really something. Shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me inasmuch. And why did God do this? I was found innocent before God. I did nothing wrong before God. Why? He was loyal to God. And even what? Also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. I haven't done anything wrong towards you in praying to my God, in being faithful to my God. In my loyalty to you, I have been faithful in the management of the kingdom. Then the king was very pleased. Notice now the state of happiness, and gave orders, take Daniel. Now that Daniel was placed, the punishment was done. He survived the night. He gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and they looked, and what? No injury whatever was found on him. Remember the 3 Hebrew boys again coming out of the fire, and they began to look at their bodies and notice not even their clothing, not even a hair on their head was singed. After looking and investigating and looking over them, same thing we have for Daniel. The events are absolutely parallel in theme. No injury was found on him. Why? Again, because he had trusted in his God. Theme reiteration. Now we have a reversal of fates. Remember those satraps and commissioners who had reasoned together to have Daniel thrown into the lion's den, have the king do this by virtue of edict? Now we have a reversal of fortune, and they themselves are now cast before the lions. And now let's see what God will save them. None. Their gods are no gods at all. Their gods are idols of wood and bronze and steel, who cannot see, who cannot hear, and has no life in him. But what? The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast, now notice this, not only the men, but their children and their wives into the lion's den. So it was a big group of people that it is a sad thing. You have to be careful. There's always this principle, especially when you have certain authority, that is, things have been given to you to be over. That which is even underneath you will suffer. What do I mean? These men over their wives, they are over their children. And so therefore, as these men were caused to suffer in punishment, the punishment also applied to their families. And this also too would be a lesson for everybody else to pay attention to. Be careful what you do. And then we're going to see this at the very end of this chapter too, especially about what you say against the God of Daniel. Not only will you suffer and pay a price, but your family will too. But let's keep going. Children and wives into the lion's den. And what happened? Were they preserved? They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. In other words, the lions jumped on them and ripped all of them, women and children. The lion didn't care who it was, to shred, killed all of them. Darius responded. Notice the similarity, because we have the same thing with Nebuchadnezzar. See how parallel it is? How Nebuchadnezzar said, and I say unto all the peoples of my nations and blah, 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 never speak a word against the God of these men. Why? Who can deliver in this manner? You see it now? Same idea. What? Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land. May your peace abound. So it's a letter that goes out, similar like Nebuchadnezzar too. We saw that with the 3 Hebrew boys, the edict there. We saw that too with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar too earlier. But I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. Again, let me say this too. The insight, the spiritual insight, Darius, like Nebuchadnezzar, is a Gentile king. So therefore, there is somewhat of a prophetic inference to these events. That is, as the Gentiles are commanded, even here, first from Nebuchadnezzar, even now from Darius, as the Gentiles are commanded to reverence the God of the Jews of Daniel. Thus it will be in the latter time. And we understand the latter time is the second advent of Christ, when Jesus comes to set up his kingdom. Thus will be the decree. Jesus, who is himself also Yahweh, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, Jesus shares in that eternal, everlasting being of God. All nations, all Gentiles will worship him as well. So there's that prophetic spiritual inference that we can garner at this decree. His kingdom, notice the similar language that Nebuchadnezzar spoke concerning God. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. See how it looks forward to the coming of Christ? He delivers, that is the second advent. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders. He's thinking about Daniel in the lion's den. And notice also too, cast against what? 3 Hebrew boys as well, God delivering and performing signs and wonders. And also too, Nebuchadnezzar in that being zoanthropy, having that psychotic episode for 7 years. In heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel, just like the 3 Hebrew boys in the furnace of fire, Daniel from the power of the lions. And thus it ends. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius, and that's why we believe that Darius is different from Cyrus again, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Daniel had great success, and he continued on for some time even after that. All right. Again, but now let me give you share a little nugget with you guys since we're done here. Interesting. Notice once Babylon has basically been conquered by the Persians, notice how Daniel is no longer being referenced here as Belteshazzar. He's called Daniel. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining me with that. As I said earlier, this is a story that many of us already know. So let's just do a recap very quickly. We have the coming in of Darius the Mede, and so he wants to organize the government officials so that they could rule the kingdom on his behalf for him. He wants effectual and efficient rule in the kingdom. So he appoints 120 satraps. Over these guys, he appoints 3 commissioners. Of them was Daniel. Daniel began to exemplify his abilities, to his extraordinary abilities, and thus the king began to think to himself, I'll set Daniel over everything and everybody. This caused jealousy with the other commissioners and satraps. So they devised a plan to try to get rid of Daniel. They knew they couldn't bring any accusation against Daniel concerning his governmental duties because he was loyal and faithful and trustworthy in every respect. But they also knew that Daniel was very faithful and loyal to his God. This they used to come against him. So they came to the king and said to the king, King, make a decree that nobody can pray to any other man or God except you for 30 days, and then make this according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, a law that cannot be changed, and that is even by the king. King liked that idea of somebody having to pray to him for 30 days, and so thus he made the injunction. Daniel, after knowing about this, he still continued to be faithful and loyal to his God, and he prayed as he did 3 times a day, giving thanks to God, no doubt asking God for wisdom as well. The men, having been watching Daniel, burst into the room at a time when they knew he was praying, and they caught Daniel. Then they went to the king, and they said to the king, you said no man could pray to any other man or God except you for the 30 days, did you not? The king said yes, not knowing what these men had done or purposed in their heart. Then the accusation came. Daniel does not regard you, and Daniel has not regarded your injunction. He has been praying like he always has. The king was not like they thought he would be. Instead of being angry with Daniel, he was compassionate toward Daniel and sought with everything that he could to get Daniel free. But because of the laws of the Medes and Persians, not even the king could overturn his own law. And reluctantly, he allowed Daniel to be placed into the lion's den. All that night, the king was worried and agitated. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He didn't have the enjoyable things that he normally would have. And so early that next morning, at the break of dawn, rushing into the place where the mouth of the lion's den, he called out to Daniel to find out if Daniel was still alive. Was his God able to save him? And Daniel replied, his God indeed did save him, because he had done nothing wrong towards God. He had done nothing wrong towards the king. The king commanded Daniel to be released, and then he turned his rage and anger to those who had manipulated him, and commanded that them, their wives, and children be cast into the lion's den. And before they could even reach the bottom, the lions had completely destroyed them. In response to this, the king therefore wrote a letter and another edict that nobody should disregard or speak evil of the God of Daniel, because this God is able to deliver in an extraordinary way. And thus, Daniel was able to have peace during the reigns of Darius and Cyrus. All right. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me. Join me next time as we continue on in Daniel, and we kind of move back a little bit in time. We're going to move back into the time of Belshazzar. Remember, that was the king with the handwriting on the wall. But we're going to go back as God began to speak prophetically once again concerning the end time Gentile kingdoms. All right, guys, see you next time.